Welcome to AIPAD Talks. I'm Andra Russick of Scheinbaum and Russick in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the chair of the AIPAD Education Committee. As part of our education program, we are pleased to present AIPAD Talks. As many of you know, AIPAD is dedicated to creating and maintaining high standards in the business of exhibiting, buying, and selling photographic art. With that in mind, we're thrilled that the photography show presented by AIPAD will once again be held at the Park Avenue Armory. It's an exciting return for the show and for us to this venue, and we hope that you will all join us. Tickets are available at aipad.com. I welcome you to go onto the website and go to the show page where you can view our catalog, which has recently been put up. You can see the talks program that we'll have, the book signings that will be happening at the time, and you can also get tickets, as I said. I just want to let all of you know that this conversation today will be recorded. And let me tell you about the talk today. Collaboration is a groundbreaking publication by 5 great thinkers and practitioners in photography. In collaboration with hundreds of photographers, writers, critics, artists, and academics. This collection uses the lens of collaboration to challenge dominant narratives around photographic history and authorship. The 5 authors for this book are Ariella Aisha Azule, who is a professor of modern culture and media and comparative literature at Brown University. Lee Rayford, who is a professor of African American studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Wendy Ewald, photographer who has long collaborated on art projects throughout the world. And our 2 speakers today. Susan Meiselas is a documentary photographer and a member of Magnum since 1976. She's well known for her extensive human rights work in Latin America. She is the author of 8 books: Learn to See, Carnival Strippers, Nicaragua, Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, Encounters with the Deny, Pandora's Box, Prince Street Girls, and Eyes Open. She presently serves as the president of the Magnum Foundation. Laura Wexler is the Charles H. Farnham Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Yale University. She researches, writes, curates, and teaches about gender, race, class, sexuality, and nationalism in photographic cultures, and she directs the Photographic Memory Workshop at Yale. She has published extensively, including Pregnant Pictures and Tender Violence: Domestic Visions in an Age of U.S. Imperialism. Winner of the Joan Kelly Memorial Prize of the American Historical Association. I would like to welcome both of you to our talk, and I'm very excited to hear all about collaboration, the potential history of photography. I will say at the end of this talk, I will open it up for questions, and I will be reading the questions to our speakers so they can just focus on answering the questions. And now, without further ado, I want to pass it over to the 2 of you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andra. And thank you, AIPAD, and thank you for all of you coming to us from wherever you are. It would be nice to know where you are since you're faceless. Laura and I are 2 of the 5 authors, and what we're going to do today is really kind of walk you through the process that was over 10 years and the making of this book in collaboration with multiple communities. And we'll give you a little bit of a sense of what is in the book. So I'm going to start quickly to get to what I hope you can see. The title of the book, Collaboration: A Potential History of Photography. I think the first thing to say, and Wendy Ewald is not with us, but in this call, but Wendy and I began with a conversation. And what's really interesting to me is how a conversation, when it's interactive as it was, about our own practice, has led to the inclusion of many, many perspectives that is far beyond what we envisioned when we sat over some coffee. Our coffee was about how our process in the early 70s had begun and what the context of how we were working and what we were seeing around us, and began to think about some of the seminal projects that had shaped our thinking as we emerged as young practitioners. So I think one part of that conversation led to a meeting with Ariella Azoulay, and Ariella immediately was fascinated by what we were influenced by and then said, why not take on the whole history of photography? And I have to credit her for that, because the enormity of that only Ariella could envision at that time. We began to develop our own language for what we were going to be doing and an approach, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. So these are multitudes of names related to either people who were the practitioners in making bodies of work and the writers who we invited to respond to the work. So this is on the end papers of the book. You can see maybe there's some names you'll recognize. Hopefully there'll be many new ones that you'll discover. But the most important part of the process was moving from what was a conversation between us to classrooms, and Laura and Ariella, and eventually Lee Rayford in Berkeley and Eric Gottesman at Purchase began to develop conversations in classrooms about what collaboration meant in the practice of photography. We started off with the notion of a square, and you can see those squares on the wall, which contain photographs and primary text by the protagonist, either the maker of the photographs or someone who was in the photographs. We changed the reference of a subject to the notion of a photographed person. And as we built these relationships between different bodies of work, we started to call clusters of ideas. And what we're going to walk you through, and Laura will take it next step, into how we became inclusive, which you can see on the left, many people, many different opportunities beyond the classroom to showcase the grids that we started to develop. So the image on the right is at Ryerson in Toronto. It was at that time the Ryerson Image Center. And on the left, you see a multitude of other places where we would put the work up, invite people to take a look, and this would be the public as well as students, graduate students, faculty involved in photography. And they would put Post-it notes to critique what we had. You can see some of them in the very center. If I point I don't know if you can see my pointer, but anyway, those Post-it notes indicated what people thought were missing and could be added to the conversation. So Laura, maybe you can take
Yeah.
it next step.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So, to continue with this idea of a vocabulary that we developed, which we developed out of working together on this idea of looking at the event of photography, to use Ariella's vocabulary, through the lens of collaboration. And I want to point you to some other words, because for me, it was actually initially the words that drew me into the project and had me understand the project. First of all, the title. Collaboration, which we broke down into 8 different kinds of collaboration, and a potential history. I want to speak just briefly about both of those things. The word collaboration, when I was first invited to join this project over 10 years ago, that was a frightening word for me. Collaboration meant immediately to me something to do with the Vichy government. I wasn't sure that I wanted to spend a lot of time thinking about photography's role in events like that. But in working with this in our group work, I began to sort of calm down about what collaboration meant, to slow it down, to ask, why should it mean that? And what else can it mean? And that's really what generates these 8 different, you might call them chapters, but as you saw, we were originally on the wall, or actually we were originally in a classroom and in a box on the floor with these squares, what you might see as a deconstruction or breaking down or a parsing of all the potential ideas that make up collaboration. That to me is one of the most valuable parts of the project, is these clusters. This is cluster 1. and it's called The Photographed Person Was Always There. To me, that language was poetry. That language drew me into the project. That language made me able to look at things about the history of photography that I had recognized without being able to name. The photographed person was always there. Let me just read the cluster text to you for more vocabulary words. Despite the fact that multiple individuals are involved in the practice of photography, its history and theory have been written as the story of single heroes, the photographers looking at these series of photographs. Almost always one can see that the multiplicity is not merely a theoretical assumption, but a reality. It can hardly be denied once the presence of the photographed person is acknowledged. However, a range of procedures and tools are used to deny, suppress, or neglect this presence. The modes of participation in the act and event of photography are as varied as the photographers themselves and can be considered from this multiplicity of modes of engagement. This idea that there's a multiplicity of modes of engagement, and once you expand your peripheral vision, or the vision that's been taught to be peripheral in the way we study the history of photography, to include the photographed person, you start to see many more of the modes of engagement and collaboration that go into making any photograph. And this cluster interprets this idea. So you can see here, what you see is actually 4 columns. The first 3, you look at this, you see the geometry of a square. Those are the original squares. They are collages that we created with students and with the public and with all the people that came to the workshops. As Susan just described them, they were physical things, tiles, cards that we worked with. And when we came to turn this project into, from the walls and the classroom into a book, we added a 4th column, which is on the right-hand side. We invited writers to respond to the material that we had collaged in the square, and to meditate on how this material might have to do with the cluster title, The Photographed Person Is Always There, and to think about it. That was actually a rather unusual thing to do, to ask the writers to comment on this kind of presentation. And then when there were living photographers, we actually asked them also to comment on the writers. So it was as deeply an iterative collaboration as we were able to produce. Here is an example of the beginning photographed person in the book, Frederick Douglass, who you could say he was always there in front of the camera. He spent a lifetime traveling around and lecturing in the United States against abolition, for Reconstruction, for the continuance of true citizenship for Black citizens of the country. He and every little town that he went to in the United States over decades, he would try to find the photographer and he would have his portrait taken. So there's a kind of always it's a kind of being there with and in front of the camera that Douglass was inventing at this point as one of our earliest and most important theorists of photography. That gives you some sense, I think, at least of my poetic understanding of what it means to take the phrase always there and think of it in relationship to the practice of photography as a collaborative project. Douglass is working with all the local photographers, and he's working with his audience to whom he gave these pictures of himself. But the photographed person is always there, signifies in a different way with Edward Curtis's project of photographing supposedly disappearing Indigenous Native peoples. It's a critique. It's not, no, this person is always there. Before, during, and after Curtis's presence, these people are there. Curtis has, for multiple reasons, complicated, misnamed this, or named it appropriately for what he thought he was doing, salvage anthropology, a vanished race. But in fact, um, the perdurance of Native people is a weight that balances what the work is that Curtis thought he was doing with the work that we now understand it to be. And again, it's an associative reading. What I'm trying to do is give you a sense of my engagement, our engagement with these projects, and a sense of permission to engage in them the way you also hear them. So here is Horace Poulot, who is a native photographer. Well, sorry, was a native photographer, and he was interested in making the Kiowa people, his people, present by his photographs for themselves, not as tourist photos, not actually as mass-produced carte de visite like Douglas had the idea of doing, but making the portrait of his people always there for themselves. What you see here are three different ideas about how to use photography to collaborate with something really basically dear to your heart, or something, an important project that you're doing. This gives you an example of how the cluster text works to describe the square, and also how the writers we invited take another step of interpreting it, and how actually it invites you also to go ahead and do that with this work. We do not have a sense that these are complete, in fact, collaboration, as we discovered over it. It's actually, Susan, probably 14 years total that this project was underway. So we don't have a sense that it ends.
Yeah, well, we did stop counting the years, but
We did.
I think we have to move a little quickly to
Yeah.
cover
Okay.
enough territory. So I'm going to read just fragments here and there. So the second cluster, reshaping the authorial position, essentially this is the conversation I was explaining Wendy and I began to have. I think you'll understand when I show the work that my first project in photography, which was with a 4x5 in a boarding house where I lived at the time, not knowing my neighbors and knocking on their doors, and then beginning to share the photograph that I made and ask them to reflect on that image as they saw themselves perhaps differently than the image portrayed them. And that was the first project to deal with the power of the camera and the active representation. Wendy, as you well would know, a very famous body of work that she developed in Kentucky with students there, in which they enact their dreams and their fantasies. They are making the photographs, they're performing in the photographs. This is what Wendy has really done in various ways throughout her life, but this was her seminal project. So breaking the code of the photographer as the author of the image, as well as how the kind of participation. There's another seminal project in this cluster, which I think many of you would know, Jim Goldberg's Rich and Poor. The first time I remember seeing and the handwriting of the photograph person recording and perhaps reflecting with Jim on their life, and then putting that into words on the very print itself. So imprinting themselves along with the image Jim had made. So of course, another thing to say, Jim has done other projects that many of you would know, Raised by Wolves and others. This is when we chose a body of work, we also looked at the seminal role it might have played. And so these clusters are still organized chronologically to give a kind of progression of language. And you would see in the book that there are others, of course, after seeing this, and perhaps in different ways, writing or drawing on images to give others that kind of voice to be present. This third chapter iconization is preceded by collaboration. Again, I think this will be revealed to you rather than read the text. This is an obvious reference to Che, not just the image that was made by Corda in Cuba in 60, but also what happens to that, the circulation of that image in all the multitudes of ways. Of course, there are many more than we could represent, but he still plays a central role in Havana and is on that very building. The fact that people can continue to put him as a symbol on their bodies. I think you can understand what Che represented and why that might be the case. I always like the quote that that Che has here: "The revolution is not an apple that falls when it's ripe. You have to make it fall." So obviously we live with the legacy in many parts of the world of Che's vision. A different project in this cluster, these are not necessarily contiguous, but I'm just giving you sampling of things that you might know and therefore think about, okay. So where's the collaboration with Nick Gott making a photograph at the time of Vietnam in June 72? Many people would see this image and remember it, though certainly our generation. And its influence in mobilizing public opinion against the war in that period. We include, and we don't do this often, but there is the contact sheet because we want you to see how it was cropped. So the first collaboration beyond Nick and who he came to know as Kim Phuc much later, that is the relationship we're tracing. From the contact sheet, whoever made the actual crop, the circulation of the image, but suggesting also the importance of the relationship that you see Nick Gott both in several years later, and then Kim Phuc as an adult creating a foundation now in her in Canada. I think some of the quotes, just again to give you a flavor, Kim Phuc also, there's Nick Gott saying, and this is on the left of this square, "I took almost a roll of Tri-X film of her, then I saw her skin coming off and I stopped taking pictures. I didn't want her to die. I wanted to help her. I put my cameras down on the road." This is a classic question that we're always asked in the field, observing such dramatic events. What Kim Phuc says is, "He took my picture and now he'll be here with me with this new journey. New chapter. I really wanted to escape from that little girl, but it seems to me the picture didn't let me go. Most of the people, they know my picture, but there's very few that know about my life." So I think gives you a feeling of some of the dimension that we explore in a square.
The next cluster is when a community is at stake, and you're thinking about our peripheral vision from that the tunnel vision of the single hero that makes a photograph. We were very interested in when whole communities are engaged in or or evoked by or protected by the act of photography. So here is some photographs from the burning of photographic pass books in South Africa. And here is actually a community that says our well-being is at stake by refusing this surveillant colonial photography. And the community felt that their being was at stake and took an action against the photographs, against the passbook photographs. Communities have all kinds of feelings about photographs, and we were trying to spotlight some of the most the richest ones.
I think I was going to speak about Claudia Andujar, again, a woman who's now in near 90s and dedicated a huge amount of her life to working with and trying to protect the Yanomami people in Brazil. The quote I wanted to read you, just give you again the feeling of the tensions that live within these squares as you know, the layers you can strip away and dig into. This is from Davi Kopanawa, who we cite as one of her primary collaborators in the getting to know the Yanomami people. And he writes, or he spoke and wrote, we wrote, she taught me to fight, to defend our people, land, language, customs, festivals, dances, chants, and shamanism. I did not know how to fight against politicians, against the non-Indigenous people. It was good that she gave me the bow and arrow, not for killing whites, but for speaking in defense of the Yanomami people. So again, different kinds of relationships over time to different communities.
This, just very quickly again, is Zanelli Maholi, who was making honorific photographs of her community of lesbian and gay and trans people whose lives were actually being threatened. And she photographed her people as they wanted to be seen, and also tried to add a layer of the beauty that she saw in people who were really under risk um, of expulsion from their communities, and potentializing violence continues on to that. On with that, with again a disturbance of the language. This doesn't really mean that that we should use the potential of violence, that we should, although that's how I first read the cluster, but it rather goes back to this idea of potential, and the title of the book, Potential History. I want to note that potential history doesn't mean that this was potentially a history of photography, but we didn't quite make it. It's not a linear history of photography. It's not a survey of photography. It is not a complete history of photography in any sense. It's a gathering of practices and projects and people who have the potential for a different outcome to be created by the communal collaborative act of photography. That's what potential history is. Taking history that you think is glued down and seeing what potential there is within community or collaboration for another kind of outcome. But collaboration is not always a friendly thing. This is Marc Garanger's, these are his ID photographs that he was ordered to take as a soldier conscript to Algeria and the French forces. And these women are forcibly deveiled and furious, and are being excavated, relocated to these concentration and transit camps, and their IDs are being made in that context. He did this. He had very complicated feelings about it for the rest of his life, and he actually went back and showed them the photographs, and they responded to him about what it means for them now to see the photographs of then. So it doesn't mean that collaboration is always has a happy ending, but it means that it's an ongoing possibility.
I
Yeah.
think I was going to present this project because Lori Jo Reynolds does quite an extraordinary project with the Thames prison with a very large group of volunteer photographers. So it's inclusive. The collaboration is both with people who are in prison and the volunteer photographers responding to the notion of a request. I'm just going to read a tiny part of what Lori Jo writes. There's an artist and there's a man in the bottom of the well. At what point does the artist, who knows so much about this man, become a bystander to his suffering? In 2006, a group of artists started the TAMS Poetry Committee to provide the men with some social contact. In 2008, we launched TAMS Years 10, a legislative campaign to close the Supermax at the 10-year anniversary of its opening. In Photo Requests from Solitary, which is the name of the project, we invited men in isolation to request a photograph of anything at all, real or imagined. The requests were stunning. In reading them, we could see the images that people in isolation were thinking about. We made the images into photos and gave them back. So you get the idea. The dialogue they are having is, what would you like to see that you are constrained and unable to have access to? And that led to a dialogue and an image exchange. Laura.
And here is just quickly an example. We're actually not showing you the internal visuals of this project, which was an anthropological collection of photographs published in French called Sex, Race, and Colonies that showed and repeated the tremendous violence of colonial photography against women. And a lot of people protested the publication. They went ahead and published it anyway. We are refusing to show the pictures, and Cause Revel Collective wrote a statement of protest against these photographs, and we have included that here. So another way of using the potential of an act of violence as not concluded, but as a way to further learn, a kind of judo, or a kind of renversement of the act of violence. This is another example of it. What you're seeing is lots of examples of these forms of collaboration. Photography preserves sovereign history as incomplete, rather than believing that history is over, the sovereign idea of history. Photography is that point in a photograph, or an act of photographing, or a memory of photography, or whatever, that says, no, wait a minute, this is not actually over. What the story you're telling about this is not the whole story. And Susan, you're going to talk about
Yeah,
this.
I mean, just to give an example, I'm just paying attention to time, so of course it's hard to skip and jump through the pages of this book. But Joel Sternfeld's work on this site is I remember personally being so struck by the power of this idea. Again, what Joel writes or says to us, it occurred to me that I had held something within, a list of places that I cannot forget because of the tragedies that had identified them. I set out to photograph sites that were marked during my lifetime. Experience has taught me again and again that you can never know what lies beneath a surface or behind a facade. Our sense of place, our understanding of photographs of the landscape, is inevitably limited and fraught with misreading. So some of you would recognize this is the grocery store where, from 1955, where Emmett Till called out supposedly and lost his life as a result of that exchange. This is the tree that marks Kent State University, the image that, again, you don't see and is imagined. And the third one is from the Upper East Side, Central Park. So I think each have a story that lie behind the image. So it kind of speaks to what Laura was just commenting on. And I'm sure some of you, when you get the book, will say, how is it possible that, why is it in this cluster and not in another cluster? Those were long debates of removing and shifting and relocating the ideas, to keep a progression of ideas in each cluster.
Yeah, this you'll also recognize is Tamara Laniero holding the picture of the daguerreotype of her great grandfather Renty, who is captured in a daguerreotype, racist daguerreotype that is held by Harvard University. And Tamara is trying to say, no, 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 the story that you Harvard are telling about how you got this picture, what the picture means, and why you own it, is not the end of the story. And in fact, this is my relative. This is a family photograph, and give it back. So that's a very crystalline example of when a sovereign history, Harvard's history, is made incomplete by the existence of a photograph and someone who interprets it differently.
Yeah.
Co-archiving is
I think
also
it's pretty obvious what co-archiving is.
okay. Yeah,
Go
right.
ahead.
So these are Francis Benjamin Johnston's Hampton Institute photographs from 1899. But Carrie Mae Weems also tried to do a contemporary project, bringing archival photographs of Native Americans who were also there in the school to the fore. And the project was stopped by the Hampton administration for being politically tricky, and the idea of who owns the archive, what activation of the archive can artists do, historians, other photographers, co-archiving as a fraught collaboration, not only as a simple one.
Yeah, so this is where another project of mine comes in the obvious co-archiving process of community, a collective project bringing together the fragments of history. Just to read a short part of it, what interested me was the interaction and interplay between those who shaped Kurdish life and the lives of the chroniclers who pictured them, the photographers in those photographed, the points of cultural exchange, how the various protagonists cross one another's paths, but left the marks on Kurdish history. So I'm not deconstructing history. I'm actually trying to capture the fragments and bring it together, first in a book form, after the collecting form, then in a website, and now it continues on in an exhibition form where on the upper right you see people reading the stories that others have contributed through the website over the past decades. It really, I think, the idea of everyone having a fragment and piecing it together, even though the other ultimate image is more like a mosaic. So Kurdistan in the Shadow of History evolves through the participation of everyone. Laura.
And yeah, and finally, we actually wished we had more time on this because that's
Yeah.
a fantastic idea. So we throw we gesture, we throw it forward as we do all of these actually, which are all incomplete. But the sovereign and civil potential of the apparatus of the photography itself, the material history of the chemicals and uh, uh, of the making of the physical apparatus, the cameras, the use of this is Walker Evans and Helen Levitt underground in the subway using the right angle viewer to take photographs that are the people do not know that they're being photographed. This is actually pretty much illegal. They waited decades to publish it, and it's a kind of a foreshadowing of the surveillance cameras, but they are also fascinated by the unconscious, unself-conscious view of the faces of the commuters on the New York subway. Walker Evans, interestingly, largely focused close in on the faces themselves, and Helen Levitt on the relationships between the people. What now that our cameras are ubiquitous, what is the civil responsibility of this apparatus? What is our responsibility to it?
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
that's a perfect segue to the last project in the book, which is of the period of time just as we were closing the book a little over a year ago, year and a half ago. Of course, the viral images circulating through Iran of women, removing their hijab and trying to be present on the streets as citizens. I think what we were very struck, I think one of the quotes is, "I want to be that woman with a figure of resistance, the one I saw in the photo, and I create a figure." These figures were already present in the unconscious of the protesters without ever having been practiced, as though they had been practicing them for years. This figure of resistance, this body recorded in images, becomes, in later links of the stimulating chain of desires and incitement of other women's desire to strike their own figures. So we leave that as the last project. I just wanted to read one thing that comes from our notes towards a manifesto, which is in the introduction, and then we'll open up to a few questions. This is in our first paragraph. It's much longer. You'll forgive me for not reading it all, but I think it speaks to what our intentions were. We say this book is a practical experiment, a theoretical proposition, and a pedagogical tool for approaching that question. It is a project-based record of our thinking about the manifest and latent capacities of a picture-making practice, in which we are all deeply involved as practitioners, scholars, and teachers. In all of its iterations, collaboration was conceived as an open invitation extended to others, including you who are holding this book, to join us in thinking about collaboration as a condition of photography and to experiment with its meanings. It is fundamental that this project must be commonly pursued. So I think that's a good segue to say, are there any questions? And I'm going to stop sharing.
I'm gonna come back on. Thank you both. I mean, what an endeavor, what an amazing epic
Some
book to put
insanity
together.
involved.
Yeah. It's very big. I'm gonna ask anyone who has a question to put it into the Q&A. If you have one, that would be great. I just, again, I might have missed this, but how long was this process for you putting together this book?
You know, I would say that the evolution is the key question. It involves a series of conversations that continue to extend. So when I showed you that, I mean, it would be wonderful to make a network map. There were so many layers of conversations, moving from conversation in classrooms, as Laura pointed out. I didn't mention that we did workshops on site as we put up these grids at Ryerson, at Slout, a community gallery in Philly. We experimented with how to bring more voices in. And of course, that just elaborated our own thinking and challenged us along the way. So we tend to mark essentially the first iteration on the walls was 2013. We'd begun the conversation a few years before. That was the date of the Aperture installation. But how do you build consensus? A very important part of this is the five of us all with different perspectives complementing each other and challenging each other again, and to build a consensus. So you had to defend a project, I would say, as Laura would remember too. You could propose to the team, but we called ourselves the collab team, and I think we continue to do that. I
And
can think of lots of projects that I reluctantly felt we could not include because at some point Thames and Hudson said, you've got X number
Yeah,
of pages, you're done. So we
yeah.
have 115 projects, though we envisioned 125.
Wow.
We ran out of pages. So
But
that's,
it's not done. I mean,
of
it's
course
an
not.
invitation. When it was an exhibit on gallery walls, there were blank squares in order to invite the public, the people seeing to add their own. And when we taught, that's what we taught, and in the workshops. And we don't have any sense as we're going around and presenting the book that it's over, that this is not meant. Again, it's a potential history, meaning what is the potential of the historical product to make you see and imagine more collaboration. That's not potentially a new survey of photography that we didn't quite manage to do. So the
Yeah.
not quite managing to do is actually very important, because that is the invitation to take what is a template, which we think really it did work in the sense that it taught us so much over the years. And we think that as a pedagogical tool, it's useful to you all in thinking about this question of collaboration. But goodness, it's collaboration and it's productivity. It's hopefully not over.
Yeah, I would just add, Laura, that, I think the fact that there are two of us who are principally practitioners, we did look at this book and the threads throughout the book to hope to inspire new practice, to give people some language of where ideas have come from, but to iterate and create their own. And I think the other thing maybe, Laura, you could speak to, because the writers, many of them are quite well known and highly specialized in the areas that we invited them to respond to. There are examples of that. And there are also, postgrad students who are beginning to start their careers. And as a reader, I think there's a richness to a curatorial view, which is somewhat different than a critical theory view, or you feel that the ways in which people are writing, there's a lot of diversity in those styles and the kind of thinking that the book offers us. So I think for writers, also young writers, how to write about work. We didn't want either to dominate. We wanted them to speak to each other. And as Laura said, it was very important that the photographers read what the writers proposed, and the writers in many cases responded to those queries. So it was a dialogue.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, it just the network of writers is quite
Well, it
extensive.
was very exciting and gratifying and something we all just learned so much from. That's not a usual process. Photographers who get shows, curators write about the photographs um, to explain why the photographs are in the show, and they are happy that the photographs are in the curators write out of pleasure that the photographs are there. And that is sometimes the attitude of the writers, but there's a wider spectrum of responses to the photographs than that.
Yeah,
And that actually, we learned a lot from that.
yeah.
Um,
The
yeah.
historians also. I think it's very important that people understand the book is not just about the images and the projects, but also the ways in which they're being thought about and considered through a very diverse range of writers. That's kind of what I wanted to, because it sounds as if it's really about images, but it's the reflection on images and the kinds of concepts that you explore through the book that iterate, and they evolve. They evolve through the book. One of the things we didn't say, but the obvious wall versus a book, everyone wants a book, but the fact is a book is limited, it's linear, it creates certain constraints, whereas the grids were a beautiful, I think, approach for opening up the conversation, and certainly for multiple years. And in fact, we have two offerings to do that again. And I think it'll be, again, interesting to represent the work that way, because then you really get the feeling of a cluster of ideas, not a linear progression within a chapter, as it were.
Let me ask one of the questions that's here.
Sure.
Your book is a refreshing recontextualization of photography and exploring the possibilities of collaboration. Can you speak a bit more about how you decided on including works that did not have consent from the subject in the photograph while weighing their historical importance?
Hmm.
I think probably the most difficult one of the most difficult ones anyway, was the Garanger, which is a very live issue still. I mean, what happened was after he made the ID photographs, nobody seemed to want the prints, and he took them back with him to France, and he exhibited them in a white wall gallery, and this caused an explosion of um, discussion and dislike, actually, of that, similar to the lynching photographs that were displayed in New York, without that contextualization as art. And it continues to be a problem. We did include those images. We did not include the images in Sex, Race, and Colonies. They are some of the most, actually, I'll tell you, I was in Paris. Ariella and I were trying to get a hold of that book. There was a pile of them in the middle of the bookstore, and the top, and it's a very expensive book. The top one didn't have the cellophane on it, so I looked at the pictures. I opened it to one page. What I saw was immediately it explained something to me in a flash. It explained that if the women in people's there was a picture of a woman naked standing next to colonial soldiers dressed. This was some kind of postcard or some kind of picture that existed that they collected of the colonies, sex, race, and colonies. And what I understood in a flash is if that's your family member who was treated like that and pictured like that, um, there is not going to be forgiveness for that. We are not going to get past that. We need a way to approach and repair the harm that has been done by colonial photography in race and sex. And nothing is going to get solved until we find ways to tell those stories in a way that is not brutal and address the pain that has come down through families for that practice. I understood that in a flash. I closed the book. I called Ariel. I said, I'm not going to buy. We're not going to use this book. She said, please buy it. So I bought it. That's my book. It's on my bookshelf. I photographed it closed. We are not showing those pictures. So that was, there are two decisions. They're historically embedded. There's been a lot of iteration of Garanger's decisions and what he did. There's been very little, but the Cas Ravel made a statement, a feminist statement about this book. And we published that instead. So I think if we don't have a single policy, we have engagements with these projects and the very serious and actually potentially illuminating things we learn from engaging with the projects. And that's kind of a capsule experience that every single one of these projects produced, every single one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
So interesting and eye-opening about that. I'm going to read you one more question that's here. The editors write about their hopes the book will be useful for, in quotes, community centers and union meetings. How can such an expensive book be a pedagogical tool for schools that do not serve wealthy communities?
Yeah, that's great. And I just came from perhaps such a place. Wendy and I were just teaching at Columbia College in Chicago. First of all, fortunately, they all got a discounted book for 50% as educational environments. So that's that's great. I mean, it's a lot of book for $85 actually, from my point of view, for a teacher. But the real dream we have, all of us, for many years, was to make a map, map out the notion of a book into a box. And Laura referenced this earlier. The idea of a box would be that these squares are like tiles and they fit into a box and they have no connection to the particular structures we've created, but they give you the opportunity to move them around and add to it. And so the idea is that it's not a fixed form, it's a very fluid form. And the only issue is, can we find someone who will help sponsor the making of the box, such that, because now the intellectual labor of creating the content is essentially done, now it's a question of form and where can this go? Can it be downloadable files from a PDF? Which is, one way we've done it just now in Chicago. They chose 40 squares, that group of students that they were particularly interested in discussing, and they printed it out there in their own studio. That's another in-between iteration of what this can look like. But we are definitely looking to figure out how else to make it as accessible possible. If we could make the box would be donated to community centers around the world, frankly, not only in the US. And that's a goal. And it's probably, the book is just out two weeks, well, I guess 2 months ago. So it's still very new for us to move towards the next goal. But thank you to whomever asked that, because that's certainly on our mind.
I think it sounds like a project that kind of, in the sense of collaboration, started with bringing in people from all different levels of education and backgrounds, and now has come into its full form in the book. And now it sounds like you want to bring it back out to all those people again.
Exactly. That would be the full
Um,
circle. That would
yeah.
totally be the full circle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's our questions for now.
Okay. Great.
I have put a link into the webinar chat for everyone to get the book. If you'd like to read more about it, there's a little blurb. You can buy the book. This talk, like I said, will be on our AIPAD website in about a week or so, once we have a little bit of time to edit, and you can all come back to it there and look at it. I want to just give a brief mention. First of all, I want to thank both of you. I think it's just an amazing project that you've been involved in with. I mean, it's just so many people. So you've really, I know that you are two of the 5 kind of key people involved, but it sounds like you've had hundreds of people involved. So congratulations on getting it all together. It's a huge project. And then I also want to have Susan just briefly mention another project that she's worked on recently at the Asia Society. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. Well, this is just a one-liner to say all of you who are coming to AIPAD, just 2 blocks north of AIPAD, at 70th and Park, there's a show called Coal and Ice, which I co-curated. And it's really looking at climate change from multitudes of perspectives, over 30 photographers, both photographic and filmic. It really intends to be an immersive environment where you connect the dots. If you wonder what coal has to do with ice, that's a good start to begin, place to begin. And if you buy an AIPAD ticket, Asia Society is respecting that as admission to
Wow.
the NICE at Asia Society. So I encourage you to explore further. And thank you again to AIPAD for making this conversation possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you both so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. I can't wait to actually see a physical copy of the book and get my hands on it and take some time with it. So thank you both, and good luck with everything. And I hope
Thanks.
that we get to see you at some point soon in person. And yeah, please everyone check out our
Thanks.
website and check out the web talk, and go to the Asian Society as well while you're in New York. Thank you all. Thank
Thank
you all
you.
for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.